I'll start by observing that we sit here in 2013 with what you would call a uniquely challenging outlook, and we've heard examples of that here. We have a population rising to unprecedented levels. We have energy security under considerable constraint potentially in future years. There is some agonising, quite a deal of agonising about future food security in a rising population, and with increasing limits on new land supply, new supply of water. Climate change, which I certainly subscribe to the science of, looms, and the environment under significant pressure, and poverty, despite the large gains in lifting people out of poverty, or lifting themselves out of poverty over the last 10 years, last 20 years. There is still much of it, and in that is the seeds of social ill. But we also have uniquely strong foundations for tackling this future. Unprecedented levels of wealth, extraordinary well-being that even in my parents' generation was unforeseeable, I think, for them. Products and services of such diversity that, again, unique in human history. Communication systems that span the world and shrink it. Rights and inclusion that spread. Markets that are global increasingly. Institutions that are, while with many difficulties, are still stronger than ever they've been. And one thing that I've been struck by, having been reading the Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker over the course of the year, was an apparently inexorable decline of violence in all of its forms over the millennia. Hard to say that when there are articles appearing about a rise in domestic violence within our vicinity here, and when we see nightly news about Syria. But looking over the long term, that appears to have been the trend. So, challenging outlook and an extraordinary base of strength from which to tackle it. But to meet those challenges, we will need to rise to the occasion. We will need to think and organise and act better in business, in government, in community and in life. And I wanted to explore what that thinking needs to be, the ways of thinking, the ways of organising that will serve us well and serve us less well to deal with that future. And then to finish by reflecting, what does that mean for my current professional preoccupation, which is education. And I'll start by saying that my entire professional life has been taken up in dealing with difficult problems that did not lend themselves to simple choices and simple solutions. Would unilateral nuclear disarmament enhance or degrade our national security? What kinds of military cooperation might we have with authoritarian regimes in our vicinity that may enhance or diminish human rights and possibly, indeed, our security? Should we introduce carers' leave? What would that do for productivity? It might be good for the family, the economy might suffer. We privatise the energy system. Will the public be worse off, or in fact can you extract greater public benefits out of a privatised system? A very clear and apparent contradiction. Can we have the energy security cake and eat it when we have carbon constraints? If we have carbon constraints, is it entirely inconsistent, self-defeating, to still allow or indeed seek to export coal? Genetic modification. I've been the head of a department that has an enormous science unit, and it has an extraordinarily creative genetic or a bioscientist producing genetic traits for new plant varieties. If we release those into the environment and we get greater yields in crops, what damage will we cause to human health and to the environment in the long term? None of these had obvious answers, or the answers that I came to in all of them were not self-evident. How one gets there is what I now want to explore. And I'll start by observing, and I think Michael O'Brien mentioned Albert Einstein earlier. Well, Albert Einstein has always fascinated me because he thought beyond perception. When you're travelling as a very small particle at a very high speed, things happen that none of us would imagine to be true based on what we can see around us. And complex problems in systems require the same starting point. We have to think beyond perception. That's not something that we do well in our public debates. When we talk about tax, who hands the money over is not necessarily who really pays. You have to ask yourself, how do they pass on the cost? When the money goes to government, who then gets the proceeds? And when you do the sums and you think about where the economy may grow or shrink as a result of that change in the way money circulates, you come up with a very different answer as to who is really paying. With privatisation, the profit motive can, in the right regulatory system, and I've experienced this, actually turn to the public good. You can sell off an electricity retailer and you can have fewer people disconnected for not paying their bill. You can sell off an electricity distributor and you can have better reliability at the extremities of your rural system. It's how you regulate it. It's how you exploit the profit motive. It's how you direct it to the right ends. You can have acts of unilateral disarmament and they can increase security. And I'm old enough to have been part of a strong push for that to have occurred. And I've sat both in front of representatives of our government and a Deputy Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union and said, if you cut your nuclear weapons by 25%, we would be better off, even without any recourse to what the other side might do. Now, that actually subsequently happened, and indeed within months of my conversation with the Deputy Foreign Minister, I don't take credit for that, but it nonetheless was validated by what occurred. You can introduce carers' leave and you can be better for the economy as well as for families. You can introduce a carbon price, and I helped design the carbon price that ultimately found its way into policies of both sides of politics, a very contentious issue right now, and you can see an awful lot of money circulating, being apparently extracting an enormous economic cost, but in fact the real cost is rather different and rather less than what appears on the surface to be happening. You can reduce tariff protection. This occurred, of course, as I started my life in public office, and you can find that job losses result, but you may end up with a stronger economy. In my role in overseeing the agricultural system in Victoria, I concluded that you can have water trading which takes water out of struggling communities and they end up stronger. None of these problems lend themselves to simple application of what appears on the surface based on our direct experience to be the likely result. They need, therefore, new and stronger ways of thinking to be tackled effectively, because all of those are really, in a sense, a foretaste of the global problems that need solving creatively, innovatively, with entrepreneurship, with education, with respect to the environment over the next decades. So what do we need? We need deep knowledge that is synthesised with skilled analysis and reasoning, founded on a particular synthesis of maths and science and the humanities. None of the problems I've been involved in, none of the problems that will present themselves in the future will be tackled without strong application of multiple disciplines, integrated thinking, and an understanding of how systems work. Economic systems, ecological systems, energy systems, and so forth. We will be increasingly thinking in terms of optimisation, a fancy word for getting the trade-offs right so that overall we're happy. We will be thinking less about binary choices and more about proportionality. There are many things I want, there are some things I don't want. Whatever I choose to do, I'll change all of them. What proportion overall will optimise what I'm looking for. We will have to take account of uncertainty and distributions of results. And when one looks at the IPCC, the International Panel on Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports on what is going to happen to global temperatures and global sea levels over the next 50 to 100 years, you can see sceptics and catastrophists clustered around the same table, because there are bands, there are uncertainties, and there are some that are more benign and there are some that are more scary. And the idea that in fact we have a binary choice as to whether we believe or don't. In fact, what we have is a distribution of possibilities. We will need, with all of this discipline of thought, with all of this understanding and exploration of fact, we'll need extraordinary creativity. We'll need the entrepreneurs. We'll need the people who can calculate and take the right risks. We'll need problem solving on a grand and global scale. And in all of this, we'll need to be aware of ourselves and aware of the cultures that surround us in order that we can find the marriage of values and facts and evidence that takes us forward to deal with this future. So really, values of course matter enormously, and in the end every decision is an expression of value. But the more we can inform by the new ways or the ways of thinking, they're not new, they're out there now, but the more we can socialise them, we can collectively speak these sorts of languages, then the more we will end up with values informed by evidence and reason rather than taboos and moral absolutes. And I would love to think of public debates and tabloid headlines that actually tell us or speak in terms of system effects, optimised outcomes and uncertainty. In other words, a debate with many shades of grey or indeed many shades of many colours. These are sometimes called wicked problems. That's become perhaps a hackneyed term. In addition to thinking differently, we have to organise so differently. We will organise and indeed increasingly are organising so differently. What is needed as the overarching mode of organisation is collaboration. Collaboration within which there is a vigorous competition for ideas, for products, for services, but in the context of a collaborative ethos, with strong engagement of all of those whom this is meant to help, and strong choice placed in their hands as to what is actually done. We will not solve any problems into the future if we assume that what governments particularly can do is to direct. That is, as people become more empowered, as people become more educated, they become less directable. That is in fact a good thing. That is the essence of human rights and of liberty, of an empowerment, but it also means that governments, speaking from my own point of view, need to think about how they persuade, how they incentivise, how they organise, how they stimulate debates, how they draw the collective wisdom and ensure that decisions reflect all of that rather than that they simply determine what change is required. And here is where, certainly in my line of business, in education, and most parts of government generally, I'm going to say something which is seen as heretical, and that is that markets are central to this. Markets within a rule of law, within a democratic context, are central. Markets have a reputation, there is a sense that we are talking about an exploitative mechanism the moment we talk markets. What I'm talking about is a network of decisions made by empowered people against rules that are clear and reasonable and fair, and all of that requires this advanced capacity to think, this ability to compute, to reason, to apply values in the right kind of a way. And indeed, I mentioned Steven Pinker, and Steven Pinker ends up concluding that it is in fact education and the rise of market logic, reasoned transactions in a network of activity within a rule of law that has replaced tribalism, replaced autocracy, and probably represents the worst relationship system we could ever devise, except all the others. So, if thought and organisation and behaviour are key to the future, and new modes, rather different to those which preoccupy our daily media fare, are required, as I say, they exist, but they don't dominate, they don't prevail, then education must, of course, teach and reflect these features of mode of thinking and of organising. And education itself is, in fact, a wicked problem. How it adapts to this future is a major challenge. And it needs to both reflect the nature of all those values that I mentioned earlier, all those features I mentioned earlier, it must both reflect them and impart them. So, collaboration, competition, choice, creativity, founded on very strong understanding, subject knowledge, synthesis of maths and science and humanity, those are the directions that education must go in. And many educational debates posit one of those things against the other. It's creativity or it's literacy and numeracy. As an example, it's choice of parents or it's equity. Well, in many cases, in almost all those cases, we have no choice. We have to synthesise, we have to optimise, we have to get the proportions right. Gonski was essentially at its heart about choice with equity. I won't talk about how an education system can go there. That may come up in the discussion, but I'd leave you with the thought that to be creative, to be innovative, to solve the world's problems, to realise the opportunities, we stand at the threshold of that enormous opportunity and that enormous challenge, and thinking differently, organising differently are keys to it all, and the education system itself will of course be at the heart of that change. Thank you very much.